The sun had barely kissed the horizon when Louise Hawkins was handed over like a sack of grain at the edge of her father's dried-up property, traded to settle a water claim debt she had never once agreed to carry. The year was 1878, deep in the heart of New Mexico territory, where the land was cracked and thirsty and men made decisions with their mouths set hard and their eyes fixed on what they stood to gain. The drought that had taken hold of the Rio Salado basin that summer had turned neighbor against neighbor, and it had turned Harlan Hawkins into something Louise barely recognized anymore. He had always been a hard man, stubborn as a stone fence post and twice as cold, but she had loved him once, in the way that daughters love fathers who work their hands raw for a piece of earth worth calling their own. That love had not survived the summer of 1878. She stood in the orange light with a flour sack containing everything she owned pressed against her chest. A cotton dress, a second pair of stockings, her mother's locket, a small Bible with a cracked spine, and a folded letter from her schoolteacher in Santa Fe that said Louise had the makings of a fine mind. She had read that letter so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. The deal had been struck 2 days prior in the back room of the Dry Creek Saloon, which was the customary place where Harlan Hawkins conducted the business he was too ashamed to conduct in daylight. A man named Cutter Briggs had held the water claim on the creek that fed what remained of the Hawkins land, and Cutter Briggs had wanted something more than money, since Harlan Hawkins had none left to give. Cutter had wanted the girl. He had called it a settlement. He had called it a practical arrangement. Harlan Hawkins had called it the hardest thing he had ever done, which Louise suspected was not entirely true, because the hardest thing a man does is usually the right thing, and signing away his daughter had cost him nothing but a moment's hesitation and a glass of whiskey to wash it down. What Cutter Briggs had not accounted for was that the transaction would require a third party to process the land deed transfer, and that third party happened to be the one man in the Dry Creek Basin who kept his word even when it cost him something. Gilbert Doyle was 28 years old that summer, a cattle hand turned deed surveyor who had come to New Mexico territory 3 years prior with a U.S. Land Office commission tucked under his arm and a reputation for fair dealing that had followed him from a small town in western Kansas. He was not a large man in the way that men who relied on size tended to be large, but he was broad through the shoulders and steady in his movements, the kind of man who moved through a room without knocking things over, and who looked at a woman when she spoke rather than over her head. He had dark hair that wanted cutting and gray eyes that people sometimes described as serious, though he himself would have said they were just eyes. He had been present at the Dry Creek Saloon the evening the deal was struck, not to witness it or endorse it, but because he had come in to file a well location map, and the conversation in the back room had been conducted at a volume that suggested neither Cutter Briggs nor Harlan Hawkins possessed any capacity for discretion. Gilbert had stood at the bar with his map rolled under one arm and listened to the terms being laid out, and he had felt something cold and angular settle in his chest. He had seen Louise Hawkins only twice before. Once at the general store in Dry Creek, where she had been purchasing lamp oil and a length of thread with the careful deliberation of someone counting every cent. The second time had been at the Sunday service held in the schoolhouse, where she had sat 3 pews ahead of him and sung every hymn with the kind of quiet conviction that made him think she believed what she was singing. Both times he had thought her remarkable, and both times he had done nothing about that thought because she had been a woman going about her own business, and he had been a man who understood the difference between noticing something and reaching out to take it. The evening of the trade, he had walked out of the saloon before the final handshake, got on his horse, and ridden hard to the Hawkins property, arriving just as the last light was burning down over the mesa. Harlan Hawkins met him at the gate with the expression of a man who had already decided and did not want to be argued with. Gilbert dismounted and stood in the dusty yard and said, without raising his voice, "I know what you are doing, Harlan. I came to tell you there is another way." Harlan had pushed his hat back on his head and squinted. "You have money to pay down that water claim." "I have a proposal," Gilbert said. "I will take the claim assignment myself. I will register it through the land office, fair and legal, and you will have use of the creek through a standard water right agreement. But the girl stays on her own land." Harlan had looked at him for a long moment, and then he had said something that Louise, standing in the doorway of the house, had heard clearly, and that she would think about for a long time afterward. He had said, "Cutter won't agree to that." And Gilbert had said, "Then I will deal with Cutter." The dealing with Cutter Briggs had taken place the following morning, and had involved a combination of legal authority, a surprisingly detailed knowledge of New Mexico water law, and the quiet but unmistakable confidence of a man who was not afraid of a fight, even while actively avoiding one. Gilbert had laid out the land office regulations on water claim transfers, explained to Cutter Briggs in plain and patient terms that the arrangement he had negotiated with Harlan Hawkins held no legal standing under territorial law, and that pursuing it would invite an investigation Gilbert himself was in a position to request. And then he had offered Cutter a fair market payment on the claim from his own savings, which were not considerable but were sufficient. Cutter Briggs was a greedy man, but he was not a stupid one. He took the money. That should have been the end of it. The claim was transferred, the Hawkins land was secured, and Gilbert Doyle had ridden back toward town with the paperwork in his saddlebag, and the particular satisfaction of a man who had done the right thing, and now intended to think no more about it. But then he had returned to the Hawkins property to deliver the deed and the water right agreement, and Harlan Hawkins had met him at the gate again. And this time Harlan had said, without preamble and without apparent shame, "The deal I made with Cutter, I made it because it was the best I had. The land is the land, and I have kept it, and I thank you for your help, Doyle. But Louise is not needed here. Her sister is older and takes care of things better. Louise has always been more trouble than use." Gilbert had stood very still in the yard. He had heard horses making soft sounds in the corral and a wind coming down from the north dragging dust behind it. He had heard the particular silence of a house where someone inside was listening. He had said, "You mean to put her out?" Harlan had said, "I mean to say she is free to go where she pleases. I am not putting her out. I am releasing her from an obligation she is not suited to." Gilbert had understood then that he was looking at a man who had convinced himself that the cruelty he was committing was in fact a kindness, and that there was no argument he could make that Harlan Hawkins would hear, because the man had already built the walls around the decision and was standing behind them. He had said, "All right, but give her the papers." Harlan had frowned. "What papers?" "The deed survey on the east parcel, the 20 acres by the creek. The parcel you were going to deed to Cutter Briggs as part of the original arrangement. That parcel was going to change hands either way, and since it is no longer going to Cutter, it should go to Louise." Harlan had started to object, and Gilbert had met the objection the way he met most problems, calmly and without yielding. He had explained that the water claim transfer he had arranged had been structured to include a small land deed as part of the settlement, that this was documented in the land office filing, and that Harlan was legally required to honor it. This was not entirely true. It was approximately 40% true. But Harlan Hawkins did not know New Mexico water law, and Gilbert Doyle did, and the conversation had ended with Harlan going inside and returning with a rolled deed that covered the eastern 20 acres. Gilbert had taken it. He had not gone inside the house. He had simply ridden away, and then he had stopped at the edge of the road where the cottonwoods grew along the dry creek bed, and he had sat on his horse for a moment, thinking. He had ridden back. Louise had been standing on the front step with her flour sack pressed to her chest, and her face arranged into the expression of someone who has already decided not to cry and is applying considerable effort to that decision. She was 23 years old, and she had dark hair that she wore pinned up without much attention to style, and brown eyes that were large and steady, and she was wearing a dress that had been mended several times at the hem. She looked, Gilbert would think later, like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had gotten very good at making it look easy. He had dismounted and walked toward her with the rolled deed in his hand, and she had watched him come with an expression that was cautious and a little proud, and not at all grateful in the showy way that made people uncomfortable. He had held the deed out to her and said, "These are yours, the 20 acres on the east side." Legal title filed at the land office. She had looked at the papers in his hand and then at him. "Why?" he had said, "because they should be." She had taken the deed with both hands and looked at it for a moment, and then she had looked up at him again and said, "My father agreed to this." "Your father signed where I told him to sign," Gilbert said. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile but was close to it. "You are either a very honest man or a very clever one." "I am trying to be both," he said. "It is a considerable effort." She had tucked the deed into her flour sack alongside the Bible and the schoolteacher's letter, and then she had looked out at the road and said, very quietly, "I do not have anywhere to go." He had said, "I know." He had paused, and then he had said with some care, "There is a boarding house in Dry Creek run by a woman named Mrs. Aldecoa. She is a decent woman and she takes in female boarders when she has room. I can take you there if you want to go." Louise had looked at him again with that same careful, level gaze. "And if I do not want to go there, then I will take you wherever you do want to go," he said. "I have a horse and the rest of the day." She had stood on that step for another moment, and then she had stepped down into the dusty yard and said, "Dry Creek, then, for now." For now had stretched into something neither of them had planned. Mrs. Aldecoa's boarding house sat on the north end of Dry Creek's Main Street, a wide 2-story adobe building with a portal across the front, and a kitchen that produced smells so good they could stop a man on the street outside. Carmen Aldecoa was a woman of about 50 with silver-streaked hair and opinions she shared without invitation, and she took one look at Louise Hawkins standing in her doorway with a flour sack and a rolled deed and a careful expression and said, "Come in, then. The room on the left has a window that faces east, which means the light is good in the morning." Louise had taken the room on the left. She had been there 3 days when Gilbert Doyle came back. He had told himself he was coming to check on the deed filing status, which was a thing that could have been confirmed by a letter and did not require a personal visit. He had stood outside the boarding house in the afternoon light and had a brief internal conversation about this, and then had gone inside anyway. Mrs. Aldecoa had directed him to the small sitting room where Louise was mending the hem of her dress again, using a needle and thread she had purchased that morning from the general store using the last quarter coin she had. She had looked up when he came in and said, "Mr. Doyle." He had said, "Miss Hawkins, I wanted to make sure the deed transfer had been properly registered." "Mrs. Aldecoa helped me take it to the land office herself yesterday," Louise said. "It has been registered. The east parcel is in my name." "Good," he said. He stood there for a moment in a way that was slightly longer than a man whose business was finished would stand. "Do you have plans for it?" She set down her mending. "I have been thinking about that. 20 acres with creek access, if the water right holds, could support a small kitchen garden and perhaps some fruit trees. Peaches do well in this climate, I think, if there is enough water," he said. "There is enough water. I made sure of that when I structured the claim transfer." She looked at him steadily. "You structured it specifically for the east parcel." "I structured it so that whoever held that parcel would have reliable water access," he said. "You knew you were going to give it to me," she said. "It was not a question." He said, "I thought it was the right thing to do." She studied him with those steady brown eyes, and then she said, "Why do you keep doing right things for a woman you do not know?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things, and said, "I am not sure I can give you a clean answer to that yet." She nodded slowly, as if that were a reasonable and even satisfying response, and she picked up her mending again. "Sit down, then, Mr. Doyle, if you have time. Mrs. Aldecoa is going to bring coffee in a few minutes, and she makes it very well." He sat down. Over the following weeks, he came back regularly, always with a reason that had some minimal connection to something practical. He came to deliver a copy of the water right agreement. He came to discuss the soil composition of the east parcel, which he had looked into after their first conversation because she had mentioned it, and he was someone who looked into things. He came with a seed catalog he had ordered from a company in St. Louis, because she had said she was thinking about peaches, and he had thought she might want to see what varieties were available. Louise received each visit with the same level composure, and she asked him questions that made him think harder than he usually needed to. She asked about the land office and how it worked, and what the territorial laws were around women holding property, which were questions that led to long conversations, because the laws were complicated and often unjust, and she had sharp opinions about both facts. She told him about her life on the Hawkins land, about her mother who had died of fever when Louise was 12, about the sister who was 3 years older and had always gotten on better with their father, about the schoolteacher in Santa Fe whose letter she still kept because it was the first time anyone outside her own head had said she was capable of something beyond what was immediately in front of her. He told her about Kansas, about the cattle drives he had worked as a young man, about how he had come to be interested in land law, which had to do with a boundary dispute he had witnessed settle badly because there were no accurate surveys, and the determination he had formed after that to make sure there were. They were sitting on the portal of the boarding house one evening in late September, when the air had finally released the suffocating heat of summer, and the nights had turned clear and cool, when Louise said, "Do you intend to stay in Dry Creek?" He said, "I had not made a permanent decision. My land office commission covers the whole territory. But there is considerable work in this basin," she said. "I intend to stay. I am going to build on that parcel. Mrs. Aldecoa has agreed to teach me what she knows about adobe construction, which is considerable, and I have found a man who is willing to plow the garden plot in exchange for a share of the first year's harvest." He looked at her in the evening light, and the thing that had been growing quietly in his chest since he first handed her those papers clarified itself into something he could name. He said, "You are remarkable." She turned to look at him, and there was something warm and slightly surprised in her face. "I am practical," she said. "They are not incompatible," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the street where a man on a mule was making slow progress toward the saloon. Then she said, "My father traded me to settle a debt, Mr. Doyle. I have not forgotten that, and I am not entirely sure what to do with it yet. I want you to know that about me because I think you are being something more than a deed surveyor when you come here, and I think we should both be honest about that." He said, "You are right, and I am glad you said it. For what it is worth, I am not asking you for anything. I am just glad to be here." She looked at him again for a long moment, and then she said, "So am I. That was not nothing." They both understood that it was not nothing. October arrived with cold mornings and warm afternoons, and Louise began work on her parcel in earnest. She had her 20 acres, her water right, her deed filed clean at the land office, and a stubbornness that she had apparently inherited from her father and had the good sense to apply more productively. Gilbert came out to the parcel on a Saturday morning to find her pulling weeds along the creek bank, with a focus that suggested the weeds had personally offended her. He dismounted and tied his horse to a cottonwood and walked over and said, "Good morning." She looked up at him with mud on her hands and her hair coming loose from its pins and said, "Good morning. Do you know anything about diverting creek flow for irrigation?" He said, "Some," she said. "Then you can be useful. Come here." He spent the morning being useful, and at midday they sat in the shade of the cottonwoods and ate the lunch that Louise had brought, which was bread and cold beans and apples from a tree that grew at the edge of the property. It was not a complicated lunch, but she had packed it carefully, and that attention to care in small things was something he had noticed about her repeatedly. She said, "Tell me something you have never told anyone else." He thought about it. He said, "I used to write poetry when I was young." She stared at him. "Poetry. Cattle poetry," he said. "About the drives, it was not good," she laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, a real laugh, unguarded and sudden, and it changed her face completely. He thought it was probably the best thing he had ever heard. He said, "Your turn." She thought for a moment and said, "I used to believe I would leave New Mexico and go to Santa Fe and become a teacher. I had the whole thing planned. I had even written to the teacher training school." She paused. "Then my mother died, and the plan stopped mattering as much as what was right in front of me." He said, "It does not have to stay stopped." She looked at him. "I have 20 acres and a water claim and no house yet. Santa Fe can wait." "It can wait," he agreed. "But it does not have to disappear." She looked away down the creek, and he could see her thinking it through, and he was glad he had said it. As November settled into the basin with its short days and long cold nights, something shifted between them. It happened gradually, and then all at once, the way most important things happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of many small ones that suddenly reveal themselves to be a whole thing. He had come to help her lay the foundation stones for a small structure on the east parcel, and they had worked all day with Mrs. Aldecoa's nephew Tomas, who was 16 and strong and very serious about stonework, and by evening they had the outline of what would be a one-room house set solidly in the ground. They had stood looking at it in the late afternoon light, and Louise had said, quietly and with something that sounded almost like wonder, "That is mine." And he had said, just as quietly, "Yes." She had looked at him then, and there was something in her face that was open in a way it had not been before, something that had gotten tired of being careful and had decided, at least for this moment, to stop. She said, "Gilbert." It was the first time she had used his given name. He felt it like a bell struck in a still room. He said, "Louise," she said, "I would like you to know that I do not trust easily, and that I am trusting you, and that I need you to understand how much that costs me." He said, "I know what it costs. I will not waste it." She nodded, and then she put her hand out and he took it, and they stood there in the long late light holding hands and looking at the stone foundation of a house that was hers, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed to be said. November and December moved through the basin with the measured pace of winter in the high desert, cold and clear and wide. Gilbert had taken a room in Dry Creek above the land office, which was a practical arrangement that happened to put him in the same town as Louise, and he visited the parcel most days when weather permitted and sometimes when it did not. He helped her haul adobe bricks that she and Mrs. Aldecoa had made using a mix they learned from a woman in the Mexican Quarter named Doña Reyes, who had been building adobe houses since before either of them was born, and who had no patience for people who did not mix the straw correctly. Doña Reyes had taken a liking to Louise in the direct and practical way that certain older women take to young women they recognize as serious. She visited the parcel twice a week and supervised the wall raising with the authority of someone who had earned the right to tell other people what to do, and Louise received her instruction with the complete attention of someone who understood that there was no faster way to learn a thing than to listen to someone who already knew it. Gilbert observed all of this with a quiet pleasure that was becoming more difficult to keep quiet. He was, in the way of men who have spent a great deal of time being careful and self-contained, somewhat unpracticed at the louder expressions of feeling. But the feeling itself was not quiet at all. It was large and warm and surprisingly persistent, and it had Louise Hawkins at its center with a clarity that left very little room for doubt. On Christmas Eve, which arrived cold and brilliant and clear, the small settlement in Dry Creek gathered at the schoolhouse for a celebration that involved a great deal of music and food, and the particular warmth that comes from people who have survived a difficult year and are glad to be together in the warmth. Louise had made a sweet tamale from a recipe she had gotten from Doña Reyes, which was ambitious for a woman who had never made tamales before, but which turned out surprisingly well, and she arrived at the schoolhouse carrying them in a cloth-covered basket with her hair actually fully pinned for once, and a good blue dress that Mrs. Aldecoa had helped her press. Gilbert was already there when she arrived. He was standing near the fireplace talking to the schoolteacher, a young man named Mr. Percy Hawthorne, who had arrived from Ohio that fall and who was still adjusting to the altitude. When Louise came through the door, Gilbert looked up, and the expression that crossed his face was not a complicated one. It was simply that of a man looking at something that pleased him very much. He crossed the room to her and said, "You look well," she said. "You have a bit of adobe dust in your hair." He reached up and ran a hand through his hair and said, "I came directly from the parcel. I finished the window frame." She stared at him. "You went out to the parcel today. It is Christmas Eve." "The frame needed finishing before the next rain," he said. "Come and see it tomorrow and tell me if it is right." She looked at him for a moment with that particular look she sometimes had, the one that seemed to be measuring something internal, and then she said, "Thank you, Gilbert." He said, "Merry Christmas, Louise." They spent the evening in the warm schoolhouse, and they danced once, to a fiddle tune that Mrs. Aldecoa's nephew played with surprising skill. And it was not a complicated dance, just a simple turning step, but Gilbert's hand was steady and warm at her waist, and she found herself not thinking about the steps at all, which was unusual for her, because she generally thought about everything. In January of 1879, when the house on the east parcel was nearly finished, and the peach tree seedlings Louise had ordered from a nursery in Albuquerque had arrived packed in damp sawdust, a complication arrived in the form of Cutter Briggs. Cutter had apparently spent the autumn convincing himself that the water claim arrangement had been unfair to him, despite having received a fair cash payment and signed all the relevant documents. This kind of revisionist thinking was not uncommon among men who had expected to get more than they had gotten, and Cutter had fed it through the winter until it had grown into something he was willing to act on. He came to the land office on a January morning when Gilbert was alone, and he laid a sheaf of papers on the desk and said that he had had the original claim documents reviewed by a lawyer he had brought in from Las Cruces, and that the lawyer believed there were grounds to contest the transfer. Gilbert picked up the papers and read them carefully. He had a habit of reading legal documents very carefully, which had served him well throughout his career. He read through the lawyer's argument twice, and then he set the papers down and said, "The argument hinges on a procedural irregularity in how the original claim was filed before I was involved." Cutter said, "That is right." Gilbert said, "I am familiar with that irregularity. I noted it when I processed the transfer. The territorial water law provision that covers this situation is clear, and the resolution of the irregularity actually strengthens rather than weakens the current arrangement. I can write you a detailed explanation if you would like." Cutter looked at him with the expression of a man who had expected this to be simpler. He said, "My lawyer disagrees." Gilbert said, "Your lawyer is wrong. You are welcome to take it to the territorial court in Santa Fe, and the court will tell you the same thing I have told you, and it will cost you considerably more than the original claim was worth." He said this calmly and without heat, because he was not afraid of Cutter Briggs and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Cutter leaned on the desk and said, with a tone that was meant to be threatening and landed somewhere between threatening and petulant, "You went out of your way to protect that Hawkins girl. People have noticed. You might want to consider whether that property is worth the trouble you are making for yourself." Gilbert looked at him directly and said, "The property belongs to Miss Hawkins by legal title and registered deed. I would encourage you, very sincerely, to let this matter rest." Cutter Briggs left. He did not bring the matter to the territorial court. He had, as Gilbert had judged, done the calculation between stubbornness and expense and found that the expense was not worth it. But Gilbert rode out to the parcel that afternoon to tell Louise what had happened, because he believed she had the right to know about anything that touched her land. She listened to the account with her hands folded in her lap and her expression steady, and when he finished she said, "He will not try again," Gilbert said. "I do not believe so." but I want you to keep copies of all your documents somewhere safe, and if anyone approaches you about the property, you send them to me first," she said. "I am not afraid of Cutter Briggs." "I know you are not," he said. "I just want you to be careful." She looked at him and said, "You went to a great deal of trouble for me before you even knew me." He said, "I knew you a little." "You had seen me twice," she said. He said, "Twice was enough to know that what was happening to you was wrong." He paused, "And enough to know that you were someone I wanted to know better." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Gilbert, I want to ask you something direct." He said, "Ask." She said, "What do you want?" "Not for the land, not from the legal office, not in general terms about right and wrong. What do you want from this, from coming here from me?" He took a breath and he said, honestly and without cushioning it, "I want to court you properly if you will allow it. I want to be someone you trust completely, not just mostly. I want, if you are willing, to build something with you, not just the house, something more than the house." She looked at him for a long time in the January light that was thin and bright and came through the newly finished window at an angle that lit half her face and left the rest in shadow. Then she said, "I have 20 acres and a water right and seedling peach trees and a one-room house that needs a floor. I am not exactly what men usually seek to court." "I am not usually seeking to court anyone," he said. "This is an exception." Her mouth curved, slow and genuine. "All right, Mr. Doyle, Gilbert, you may court me." He smiled, and it was a wide and unguarded smile that changed his whole face, and she thought, seeing it, that she had been very right to trust him. What followed was the most pleasant spring that either of them could recall. Gilbert courted her in the manner of a man who took the enterprise seriously and approached it with some creativity, because he had no template for this and was largely inventing it as he went. He brought her books from a lending library he discovered in Las Cruces, 40 miles south, which he visited on a land office errand and raided shamelessly. He brought her good coffee from the general store, the kind that smelled right when you opened the bag. He came on Sunday afternoons, and they walked the creek bank together and talked about everything and nothing, about territorial politics and water law, and what the peach trees might look like in 10 years, and whether the stars they could see from this far south were different from the ones he remembered from Kansas. She cooked for him sometimes, on the small iron stove she had acquired from a family that had decided to move west, and she was a good cook in the plain and practical way of someone who had been feeding people since she was 12. He ate everything she made with the honest appreciation of a man who had subsisted on trail food for years and understood how much better things could be. He told her more about his life, in the way that comes naturally when trust is growing, and the things he told her were not always flattering but were always true. He told her about a young woman in Kansas he had thought he might marry who had instead married a banker, and how he had been more relieved than hurt, which had told him something. He told her about a cattle drive that had gone badly, that had cost lives, and how he had carried the weight of that for a long time. He told her that he had chosen survey work partly because it allowed him to move and partly because it gave him a sense of making something permanent and right in a landscape where too many things were neither. She told him things she had told no one else. She told him about the night her mother died, about sitting by the bed until morning, and then going out and feeding the chickens because they needed feeding, and because she needed something to do with her hands. She told him about the arguments she had had with her father over the years, about her right to read and learn and want things, about how those arguments had eventually simply stopped, not because anyone had won, but because they had both given up on the possibility of being understood by the other. She told him that the hardest part of being traded was not the being traded itself, but the moment she had understood that her father had never really seen her as a person whose preferences needed to be considered. He listened to all of this with full attention, and he did not try to fix it or minimize it or explain Harlan Hawkins into something more forgivable than he was. He just listened, and when she finished, he said, "You have carried a great deal," she said. "Everyone carries something." "Yes," he said, but not everyone carries it as well as you do." She looked at him steadily and said, "You are very good for me, Gilbert Doyle." He said, "I intend to keep being good for you, for as long as you will allow it." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat like that for a while in the warmth of the small stove, while the March wind moved outside against the new adobe walls of her house. The house was finished in April, floor and all, with a small covered porch on the south side that caught the afternoon sun, and a kitchen area separated from the main room by a shelf that Louise had built herself with help from Tomás, using lumber hauled from the mill in Las Cruces. She had a table and 2 chairs and a bed frame she had traded her mending services to a local carpenter for, and she had curtains on the window that she had made from flour sacking that she had washed and dyed blue with a plant dye that Doña Reyes had shown her. The curtains were exactly the color of early morning sky, and they made the room look, as Mrs. Aldecoa said when she came to see it, like a place where someone intended to stay. Louise's peach trees were planted along the south-facing slope near the creek, 12 of them in 2 rows, and she had also planted a kitchen garden with tomatoes, squash, beans, and peppers from seeds she had saved and traded for through the winter. The garden, given the reliable water from the creek, was doing what gardens do with sufficient water in New Mexico sun, which is to say it was growing with an enthusiasm that bordered on ambition. She had also, quietly and without making much of it, written again to the teacher training school in Santa Fe. She told Gilbert about it on a warm April evening, sitting on the south porch while the light went long and amber over the mesa. She said, "I wrote to the school. I do not know if they will accept me or what the terms would be, but I wrote." He said, "Good," she said. "You are not concerned about what it might mean. If I were accepted, I would need to go to Santa Fe for some period of time." He said, "I have a land office commission that covers the whole territory, including Santa Fe. There is considerable survey work up there." She looked at him. "That is very conveniently flexible," he said. "I am a flexible man." She shook her head, but she was smiling. "I have not been accepted yet. It may not come to anything." "It will come to something," he said. "You are the most persistent person I have met in 10 years of dealing with people, and I say that as someone who deeply admires persistence." She laughed, and he looked at her in the late light, and the thing in his chest was so clear and certain by now that it felt like a solid fact, like a surveyed boundary on good land. He knew exactly where he stood. He knew exactly what he wanted. He said, "Louise." She turned to look at him, and something in his voice made her still. He said, "I love you. I want to marry you if you will have me. I want to be your husband, and I want this to be our land, and I want to plant more peach trees, and I want to grow old with you on this porch, and I am asking you plain and honest with nothing hidden." She was quiet for a long moment, and he let her be quiet, because he had said what he had to say, and the rest was hers to decide. Then she said, "My father signed away my future without asking me. You have spent every day since then asking me. Asking what I want, asking what I think, asking if I am all right, asking before you act." She paused. "The answer is yes to all of it. Yes, Gilbert." He reached out and took her hand, and they stayed on the porch until the stars came out and the night cooled down around them, and neither of them was in any hurry to go anywhere, because they were both exactly where they wanted to be. They were married in June of 1879 in the schoolhouse in Dry Creek, which was the largest interior space available, and which Mr. Percy Hawthorne, the Ohio schoolteacher, had decorated with wildflowers that his students had gathered from the mesa. It was not a large wedding, because neither of them had a large family present, but it was attended by Mrs. Aldecoa, who cried in a dignified and deliberate way, and Doña Reyes, who wore her best black dress and brought a rice pudding that was extraordinary, and Tomás, who had grown considerably since October and was still very serious about stonework, and several of the surrounding homesteaders who had come to know them both over the months, and the postmaster, and the man who ran the livery stable, who brought a very good bottle of brandy that had been purchased in Albuquerque. The minister who performed the ceremony was a circuit preacher named Reverend Amos Cole, who traveled the Rio Salado basin on a big gray mule, and was known for performing marriages and funerals with equal amounts of both gravity and warmth, which is the correct proportion for both sacraments. When it was done and the ring was on Louise's finger, a plain gold band that Gilbert had ordered from a jeweler in Santa Fe, and that had arrived 3 days before the ceremony, just barely in time, she looked up at him and said, "Husband." He said, "Wife." And then he kissed her and Mrs. Aldecoa cried again, and Doña Reyes pronounced the rice pudding ready, and the celebration was warm and long and full of music, because Mrs. Aldecoa's nephew Tomás had brought his fiddle. Louise moved her things from the boarding house to the East Parcel house that same day, which was not a large undertaking because her things still fit in a flour sack plus a small wooden box she had acquired. But she had also accumulated some books from Gilbert's lending library raids, and a jar of the blue dye that Doña Reyes had made for her curtains, and a small clay pot that one of the Mexican quarter women had given her when she heard Louise was getting married. Gilbert moved in from his room above the land office, which he had not been sorry to leave, bringing his survey equipment, his clothing, a box of law books and land records, and a photograph in a tin frame of his parents standing in front of their house in Kansas, which he set on the shelf beside Louise's Bible and the schoolteacher's letter. Their first night in the house together was quiet and warm in theirs, and they lay awake a long time talking in the dark, not because there was so much urgent left to say, but because talking to each other in the dark was something neither of them had known they wanted until they had it, and now could not imagine not having. The summer of 1879 was milder than the summer before, and the creek ran clean and steady through the East Parcel, with the reliable supply that the water right guaranteed. Louise's garden produced more tomatoes than 2 people could eat, and she put up preserves using a technique she learned from Doña Reyes, and lined them in jars on the kitchen shelf, until the shelf looked like a painting of the colors of summer. The peach trees were growing well, establishing their roots in the creek-adjacent soil, and though they would not produce fruit for another year or 2, they were lush and green and carried themselves with a kind of confidence that Louise said she found personally encouraging. Gilbert's land office work kept him occupied through the week, and sometimes took him away for 2 or 3 days when there were boundary surveys to be run in outlying areas, and Louise used those days to work the land and read and write letters to Santa Fe. She also began, quietly and without making a great announcement of it, to tutor the children of 2 neighboring homestead families who lived within walking distance, and whose children had no access to the Dry Creek School, which was too far for small legs to travel daily. She taught them to read and do sums at her kitchen table in the mornings, and she charged nothing for it, and the parents paid her in labor and goods and fresh eggs, which was a reasonable exchange. The response from the teacher training school in Santa Fe arrived in August, on a day when Gilbert was home, and they were eating breakfast on the south porch with the morning still cool enough to be pleasant. Louise opened the letter with careful hands and read it twice without saying anything, and then she set it on the table and looked at Gilbert with an expression he had not seen before, which was the expression of someone who is trying to contain something too large for the container. She said, "They will accept me into the correspondence program. I do not need to go to Santa Fe in person. They will send the coursework and I will complete it here and send it back." He said, "Louise," she said, "I am going to be a teacher." He said, "You already are." She looked at him across the breakfast table in the morning light, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was close to them, the particular brightness of someone who had held a hope quietly for a very long time and had just been told it was real. She said, "You told me in October that Santa Fe did not have to disappear." He said, "I remember," she said. "Thank you for that." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Thank you for writing to them." She squeezed his hand and then stood up and said, "I am going to get my good pen. I want to write back today." He watched her go inside, and he sat on the south porch in the morning light with his coffee going cool in his hand, and he thought that he was the most fortunate man in New Mexico Territory, which was a large territory and contained a considerable number of men, but he was standing by his assessment. Autumn brought the first harvest, modest but real, from Louise's garden. It also brought the first indication that they were going to have a child. Louise told him on an October evening, direct and without embellishment, in the manner of someone reporting a fact that they regard as both remarkable and true. She said, "I believe I am pregnant. Mrs. Aldecoa thinks so as well, and she has more experience with these things than either of us." He had sat very still for a moment, and then he had said, "Are you all right?" She had said, "I am very well. I am not frightened. I am actually quite glad." She had paused. "Are you?" He had stood up and come around the table and held her face in his hands and said, "I am so glad, Louise. I am profoundly and completely glad." She had put her hands over his and said, "Good. Then we are in agreement." The winter of 1879 into 1880 passed warmly. Gilbert modified the house slightly, extending the main room to accommodate a crib and a small rocking chair that he built himself over 2 weekends with lumber from Las Cruces, using a pattern from a woodworking almanac and a determination that was inversely proportional to his carpentry experience. The chair had a slight wobble that Louise said was a feature rather than a flaw, and she meant it. Doña Reyes took it upon herself to begin appearing at the house with regularity, bearing herbal preparations and specific advice about everything from what Louise should eat to what direction the crib should face to ensure the baby's good temperament. Louise received all of it with the same attentive respect she gave all genuine expertise, and recorded the most practical portions in a small journal she had begun keeping. Harlan Hawkins did not come. Louise's sister, whose name was Edna, came once in November, making the ride alone from the family property, and she sat in Louise's kitchen and drank coffee and looked around at the house with something that was partly admiration and partly something older and harder to name. She said, "You have done well for yourself." Louise said, "I have worked for what I have." Edna said, "Father is not well." Louise said, "I am sorry to hear that." There was a pause. Then Edna said, "He knows he was wrong." Louise said, "Has he said so?" Edna looked at her hands. "Not in those words." Louise said, "Then I am glad he is thinking about it." She said it without heat, without cruelty, simply as a statement of fact, and then she offered Edna more coffee and asked about the property and the sister's 2 children, and the conversation moved to things that were easier for both of them. After Edna left, Gilbert said, "How are you?" Louise said, "I am all right. I made my peace with my father the morning I walked out of that yard. I do not wish him harm, but I do not wish for anything from him either. I have what I need." She put her hand on her belly, rounded now with 5 months of growing. "I have more than I need." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they stood at the kitchen window and watched Edna's horse get smaller on the road south. Their son was born on the 14th of February, 1880, which Gilbert said was convenient because it was a date that would be easy to remember, and Louise said was not convenient at all because the labor had been 17 hours, and then she looked at the baby and said it had been entirely worth it. Doña Reyes attended the birth along with Mrs. Aldecoa, and between the 2 of them they had the situation well managed, and Gilbert waited on the south porch in the February cold with his hat in his hands, until Mrs. Aldecoa came out and told him it was done, and that both mother and child were healthy. He had gone inside and found Louise sitting up in bed looking tired and luminous, holding a bundle that was their son, and he had sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby's face, which was small and red and very serious, and he had said, "He has your eyes." Louise had said, "He has your chin." He had said, "What shall we call him?" She had said, "I would like to name him Robert after my mother's father, who was a good man." Robert William Doyle. He had said, "Robert William Doyle, that is a good name for a serious boy." Robert William Doyle was indeed a serious boy from the beginning, which is to say that he regarded the world with large eyes and a focused attention that made the people around him feel they were being evaluated. He was also, when he decided to smile, remarkably effective at it, in the way that serious people sometimes are. Spring came to the east parcel with its usual burst of energy, and the peach trees bloomed for the first time, pink blossoms that Louise walked out to see on a March morning, while Robert slept in the cradle that Gilbert was rocking with one foot while reading a land office survey report. She stood among the blooming trees and looked at what she had built, the house with its blue curtains, the garden coming back to life, the creek running clear through her land, the peach trees that she had planted from seedlings the previous year now standing tall enough to reach. And she felt something that was deep and quiet and real, the particular feeling of a person who has constructed something lasting with their own hands and their own will. She had sent off 3 months of correspondence coursework to the teacher training school in Santa Fe that morning, the third batch she had completed since August. The school teacher, Mr. Hawthorne, had told her he was considering moving back to Ohio, and there had been a quiet conversation among the Dry Creek families about what might be done about the school. Louise had not said anything yet, but she was thinking about it. The summer of 1880 brought 2 things Louise had been working toward. The peach trees produced fruit, not abundantly, as first-year production rarely is, but genuinely and with the particular sweetness of a peach grown in New Mexico sun on well-watered soil. Louise preserved a dozen jars and gave 4 of them to Doña Reyes and 2 to Mrs. Aldecoa, and kept the rest on her kitchen shelf, where they caught the afternoon light through the blue curtains. The second thing was a letter from the teacher training school confirming that Louise had completed sufficient coursework to be provisionally certified as a district school teacher under New Mexico territorial standards. She took both pieces of news to Gilbert on the same evening, which was perhaps too much good fortune for a single evening, but neither piece felt inclined to wait. He read the certification letter while eating a peach and said, "You are a certified teacher," she said, "provisionally." He said, "I will speak to the school board on Monday," she said. "I would like to speak to them myself, thank you," he said. "Of course, I am sorry, I will be very quiet in the corner." She said, "There is no corner, it will just be me and the board," he said. "Then I will be very quiet at home." She laughed, and he looked at her over the peach, and he thought for what was perhaps the 1000th time that he was the most fortunate man in the territory, and that the assessment continued to hold. Louise presented herself to the Dry Creek School Board in August of 1880, bringing her provisional certification, a letter of support from Mr. Hawthorne attesting to her qualifications, and a level composure that did not waver even when one of the board members, a man named Hadley who had an opinion about everything, said he was not sure a woman with a young child could give the school adequate attention. Louise had said with perfect calm, "Mr. Hadley, I have managed a homestead, raised a house from the foundation up, established a productive kitchen garden and orchard, completed a full teacher training correspondence program, and tutored 6 children to reading competency in the past year, all while caring for my son. I believe I can give the school adequate attention." Mr. Hadley had blinked. The other 2 board members had looked at each other and then back at Louise. The vote had been 2-1. Louise Doyle became the Dry Creek school teacher in September of 1880, and the school, which had been run with considerable good intentions and limited results by Mr. Hawthorne, was transformed over the following months into something that parents talked about with actual enthusiasm, which was not a word previously associated with schools in the Rio Salado Basin. She taught 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, in a single room, with the focused efficiency of someone who had been planning this for 15 years and was finally in the right place. She sent to Santa Fe for additional books. She wrote to the Territorial Education Office with requests for maps and a proper globe, and received the globe in November, which she placed on the corner of her desk, and which the children touched with reverent fingers. Gilbert, watching all of this with the particular pleasure of someone whose faith in a person has been entirely confirmed, continued his survey work and came home every evening to a wife who had interesting things to say about the day, and a son who was growing into a cheerful and sturdy 1-year-old with a habit of examining small objects with great seriousness, and a house that smelled of cooking and wood smoke, and in season of peaches. The Dry Creek community, which had watched the events of the previous 2 years with the close attention that small communities give to anything interesting, had largely decided that the Doyles were good people and welcome additions to the basin. Gilbert was known as a fair dealer, and a man you could bring a dispute to and get a straight answer. Louise was known as a woman who taught your children to read and did not condescend to you while doing it. Both descriptions were accurate. Cutter Briggs had moved on from the basin sometime in early 1880, his water claims settled, and his interest in the area apparently exhausted. Harlan Hawkins, Louise's father, died in November of 1880 of pneumonia, which his sister Edna reported in a brief letter that arrived with the first winter snow. Louise read the letter at the kitchen table and sat quietly for a while, and Gilbert sat across from her and did not say anything immediately because he understood that she needed a moment with whatever she was feeling. After a while she said, "I am sorry he never said it." He said, "I know," she said. "I am sorry he was the kind of man who could not. I think he might have been different once. I think my mother's death changed him." He said, "That is a generous thought." She said, "I do not know if it is generous or just true. Either way, it is what I believe." She folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. "I am going to make Robert a peach preserve sandwich for his lunch tomorrow, and I am going to go to school on Monday and teach long division to 11 children who find it impossible, and I am going to be all right." He said, "I know you are." She looked at him across the table. "I am all right partly because of you." He said, "You would have been all right regardless. I have just been very glad to be here." She reached across and took his hand, and he held it, and the fire in the small iron stove burned steadily, and outside the first snow of the season was making the east parcel quietly white. Edna Hawkins came to see Louise one more time in the spring of 1881, riding down from the family property with the deed to the Hawkins land in her saddlebag. Harlan's estate, such as it was, had passed to both daughters under territorial inheritance law, which meant that Louise had a claim to half of it. Edna had not come to dispute this. She had come, with some difficulty and a pride that was visibly at war with itself, to acknowledge it and to propose that they find a fair arrangement. Louise had sat across from her sister at the kitchen table, with Robert playing on the floor between them and the spring light coming through the blue curtains, and they had worked it out practically and without drama. Louise would hold her half-interest in the Hawkins land in name but would not interfere with Edna's management of it. If Edna chose to sell, Louise would receive her portion. If Louise chose to release her claim, she could do so at any time. Either way, the east parcel was and would remain entirely Louise's. After Edna left, Gilbert said, "That was well handled." Louise said, "She tried. It is more than I expected." He said, "She is her father's daughter." Louise said, "So am I, but we both got to decide what to do with that." She looked at him with the particular look she sometimes had, the one that he had come to understand meant she was thinking about something big, and she said, "I think I might like to have another child, when you are ready." He looked at her and said, "I have been ready since February when I met Robert and discovered that being a father is the second best thing that has ever happened to me." She said, "What is the first?" He said, "You." She shook her head at him the way she did when he said something that was too sincere for her to absorb without making a small deflective gesture, and then she said, "All right." Another child then. Their second child, a daughter, was born in December of 1881. Arriving in less time and with less ceremony than Robert had, which Mrs. Aldecoa said was typical of second children. She was born with dark hair like her mother and gray eyes like her father, and she was, from the first moment, the least serious person in the household, which, considering Robert's disposition, provided a useful balance. Louise named her Clara after no one in particular, just because she liked the sound of it and the way it felt in her mouth, clean and bright and exactly right. Clara Amelia Doyle, and she came into the world looking at everything with wide, delighted eyes, as if the world were a present she had been expecting, and it had turned out even better than anticipated. Gilbert held her on the first night, sitting in the not-quite-steady rocking chair in the glow of the lamp, and he thought about the October evening 2 years past when he had stood outside the boarding house arguing with himself about whether he had a reason to go inside, and about the flour sack and the rolled deed and Louise standing on the front step with her chin up, and about all the things that had happened in the distance between that evening and this one. He thought that the distance was full of good things, more good things than he had known how to want for himself, and that he had the great and specific fortune of having stumbled into them by doing the right thing at the right moment, and that for the rest of his life he intended to keep doing right things, because the evidence strongly supported the practice. Louise came and stood in the doorway of the main room, watching him with Clara, and she said softly, "She is looking at you like you hung the stars." He said, "She has excellent judgment." Louise crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and watched her husband and her daughter in the lamplight, and she felt the particular weight of a life that is full, not heavy, not burdensome, but full in the way of a jar of peach preserves in autumn, containing something made from effort and sunlight and time. She said, "Gilbert." He looked up. She said, "I want to tell you something." He waited. She said, "On the day you came to the Hawkins property and handed me those papers, I thought you were either the most honest man I had ever met or the most clever one. And I had decided, by the time you rode away the first time, that I was going to trust you. It was the clearest decision I had made in years, and I made it in about 30 seconds, which is not like me." He said, "I know it is not like you," she said. "I made it because of the way you handed me the papers. You just held them out and said they were mine, not as a favor, not with strings, just as a fact, the way you would tell someone the time of day or which road to take, like my having them was simply the correct state of affairs." He said, "It was." She said, "I know that." But no one had ever acted on it before. He was quiet for a moment, rocking the chair slightly, and Clara had closed her eyes, apparently having decided that her father was adequately dependable to sleep on. He said, "You deserved better than what you had. That was not complicated." She said, "It was, though. It was very complicated for you to do. You paid your own money for that claim. You stood up to Cutter Briggs. You argued with my father. You came back twice." He said, "I was motivated." She said, "By what? You barely knew me." He looked at her across the lamplight room and said, "By the fact that you were standing there with that flour sack and that deed, and that look on your face, like you were going to be perfectly fine no matter what, and I thought that the least the world could do was give you a chance to prove it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Did you know that day that you were going to fall in love with me?" He said, "No, I thought I was just doing the right thing. It was not until much later that I understood the right thing had been specifically and precisely the right thing for me." She smiled at him, the full open smile that still, after 2 years of marriage, made him feel as if the room had gotten brighter. She said, "It was the right thing for me too." The years that followed were the years that good lives are made of, which is to say they were full of ordinary and extraordinary things in roughly equal measure, the ordinary ones providing the texture and the extraordinary ones providing the punctuation. The East parcel expanded. Gilbert used a modest amount of savings and a land purchase facilitated through his land office connections to acquire the adjacent 12 acres to the north, doubling their holding to 32 acres, which gave them room for a proper orchard. Louise's peach trees had by now established themselves as productive and serious about their work, and Gilbert added apple trees and an apricot grove along the north face of the slope where the morning light was good. The house expanded too. The one-room adobe became 2 rooms, and then 3, each addition planned by Louise with Doña Reyes, who was 73 now and slower on her feet, but no less authoritative about the correct direction for ceilings to slope. The south porch was widened and roofed, and Gilbert built a second rocking chair, this one without the wobble, and Louise told him it was a significant improvement, and he said he had practiced. Robert Doyle grew into a serious and clever boy who had his mother's stubbornness and his father's patience, an unusual combination that made him very effective at negotiating with other children and fairly formidable at arithmetic. He started school at the Dry Creek Schoolhouse in the fall of 1885, which was the somewhat unusual circumstance of being taught by his own mother, and he navigated this with dignity by treating her exactly as he would any other teacher during school hours, which she respected enormously. Clara Doyle grew into a loud and enthusiastic girl who approached the world as an ongoing source of entertainment, and who had by the age of 4 established a particular friendship with the apple trees in the orchard, visiting them daily and apparently conducting extended conversations with them that she declined to report on. She was, everyone agreed, an original, and she would likely be either a great deal of trouble or a great deal of use to the world, possibly both. Tomás, Mrs. Aldecoa's nephew, had become a genuine friend to both Doyles over the years, and in 1882 he had married a young woman named Lucia from the Mexican Quarter, and they lived 2 miles east of the parcel and built a house that was, as everyone expected, very well constructed. He and Gilbert had developed the easy friendship of 2 men who are competent at different things and respect each other for it, and on summer evenings there were frequent gatherings between the 2 households that were informal and warm and went long into the night. Mrs. Aldecoa herself remained the great constant of Dry Creek's social fabric, present at every significant event and most insignificant ones, opinionated about everything and wrong about very little. When she turned 60, Louise organized a celebration at the schoolhouse that was attended by what seemed like half the basin, and Mrs. Aldecoa cried the deliberate and dignified tears of a woman who has been properly appreciated and knows it. Doña Reyes died in the spring of 1883, very peacefully and in her own house and on her own terms, which was what she had always intended. Louise went to the house and sat with her on her last 2 days, because Doña Reyes had asked her to, and afterward Louise came home to the east parcel and stood among the peach trees for a long time, not crying exactly, just being present with the particular weight of losing someone who had given you things you would carry forward. Gilbert had found her there in the late afternoon and stood beside her without saying anything, because he knew when she needed talking and when she needed company, and this was the latter. After a while she said, "She taught me how to build a house. She taught me how to make preserves and how to dye cloth and how to mix a clay wash for walls. She taught me about the plants along the creek and which ones heal and which ones hurt." She paused. "She was a very thorough woman," he said. "She was." Louise said, "I want to teach those things to Clara." He said, "Clara will be an excellent student once you get her to stop talking to the trees long enough to listen." Louise almost laughed and almost cried simultaneously, and the result was something in between that he put his arm around and held quietly until it resolved into a long breath and a leaning against his shoulder. She said, "Thank you for this, for all of this." He pressed his lips to her hair. "Thank you for letting me be part of it." By 1885, Dry Creek had grown. The basin had attracted new settlers as the water situation stabilized, partly due to Gilbert's ongoing work with the land office to establish clear and fair water right allocations throughout the area, which was work he pursued with the tenacity of someone who understood that land without water was just dirt, and that people needed both to build a life on. The town had a new general store that was twice the size of the old one, a proper hotel, a doctor who had come from Albuquerque and who was married to a woman who turned out to be a remarkable herbalist, and a church that had been built the previous year, and that served Sunday service to a congregation of 40. The schoolhouse had been expanded, and Louise's student count had grown to 31, which was a great many children for one room, but Louise managed it with the organizational precision of someone who had run a homestead while also completing a correspondence degree, while also nursing a baby, and who had therefore developed a very efficient relationship with time. She had also, over the years, written several letters to the Territorial Education Office about the state of rural schools in New Mexico, specific and well-argued letters that cited data and proposed solutions, and were written in the kind of prose that is hard to ignore because it leaves no room for ambiguity. One of these letters had resulted in the territory sending a school inspector who had visited Dry Creek, been impressed, and subsequently used the Dry Creek School as a model in his report to the Legislative Assembly. Louise had found out about this through the Albuquerque newspaper and had sat at the kitchen table and read the relevant paragraph 4 times. Gilbert had said, "You are in the newspaper." She had said, "It does not name me. It just says the Dry Creek School." He had said, "You know it is you." She had said, "Yes, I know." She had set the newspaper down and looked at the window where the blue curtains that had faded and been replaced twice now hung in the afternoon light, and she had said, "I used to want to go to Santa Fe to become a teacher. I wanted to get away from here and become something." He had said, "And instead," she had said, "and instead I stayed here and built something." He had looked at her with the full and uncomplicated love of a man who has watched a woman build a life from the ground up and knows he has been the luckiest person in the room throughout the process. He said, "Was that all right?" She said, "It was better." On a warm evening in June of 1886, when Robert was 6 years old and Clara was 4, and the peach trees were heavy with the fruit of their 7th season, Louise and Gilbert sat on the wide south porch in the rocking chairs that both now had slight wobbles because they were well used, and the children were inside on the floor playing a game that involved a considerable amount of dispute and very little resolution. And the basin was golden in the late light and the creek could be heard running steady through the orchard. Louise said, "Do you remember what you said to me on the day you handed me the papers? You said they should be mine because they simply should be." He said, "I remember." She said, "You have said simple and right things to me for 8 years, Gilbert. I want you to know that I have noticed every one of them." He said, "I have been lucky to be speaking to someone who was listening." She said, "I was always listening." He reached across the small space between the chairs and took her hand, and she let him hold it in that way they had developed over years, easy and warm and habitual in the best sense, the way of two people who have built the habit of reaching for each other. She said, "I want to plant more peach trees next spring, along the north edge." He said, "How many?" She said, "As many as will fit." He said, "That is a great many peach trees." She said, "Yes, that is the idea." He said, "What will we do with all those peaches?" She said, "We will preserve them and give them to people and sell them at market and eat them in the sun. And in 30 years Robert will sell them and Clara's children will eat them, and someone who has not been born yet will sit in the shade of those trees and think that whoever planted them must have loved this place very much." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the evening settling over the land, their land, the land that had come to him through the specific and unlikely route of a deed handed to a woman on a doorstep in October of 1878. He said, "They will be right." She said, "They will." She squeezed his hand. "We do love it," he said. "We love it very much." Inside, Robert and Clara's dispute apparently resolved itself into a game that both parties found acceptable, because the volume decreased and was replaced by the sound of laughter, which was Clara's laugh, high and sudden and delighted, and then Robert's, lower and more reluctant but real. Louise and Gilbert sat on the porch as the light went, holding hands in the old way, and the creek ran through the orchard, and the peach trees stood patient and laden in the last of the evening, and the house behind them was solid adobe and good wood and blue curtains, and the accumulated warmth of 8 years of people who loved each other living well and honestly in the rooms they had built together. The stars came out over the Rio Salado basin one by one, and the night settled warm and full over the east parcel, over the land that had begun as 20 acres of deed paper held out in the open hand of a man who believed that doing the right thing was usually just a matter of doing it, and had become, through the particular alchemy of care and time, and two people who had chosen each other clearly and kept choosing, something that would last well beyond either of them, root deep in the New Mexico soil. Patient and growing and permanently, irreversibly theirs.